Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the kind invitation. It's the first time ever I meet Professor EUNMUTE in person, although I knew of her work and have admired it for a very long time. So when she invited me, of course, I said yes immediately. And it's also for me a bit of a homecoming here in Brussels, as you will have gathered from the way that my CV was read up. I like to travel, but I always particularly like to come back here in Brussels too. So I should clarify in the beginning, I'm talking here about union law democracy, so democracy as a union law concept. And my purpose for today is, rather than answering questions or taking a very specific position, what I want to do is throw up questions. What are we actually looking at here? And I think that this is important because we don't really know yet, and that's probably the only firm statement that I make here. We don't really know yet what it means precisely, but we also know that we're going to have to find out very quickly, because I think it's extremely likely that within the next 5 to 7 years we will have quite a significant discussion about what union law democracy means, and that's why the subtitle of my talk is. Trying to see if I can get this to work. What is the EU talking about when it mentions democracy? And it mentions in quite a lot of different ways. I'm going to show you. And the second thing, I'm a practitioner, as Professor EUNMUTE already mentioned. Why does it actually matter, and in what context? As a professor, I'm involved in quite a lot of strategic litigation. So what I try to do in preparing this talk is, some of the examples that I'll give is how can we actually envision that this could at all be used in some form of litigation? And I see some people who are sometimes in court too here. My purpose for today is really just to throw up lots of questions and to convince you at least of the fact that these are questions that are going to be very important in the short term. We don't know yet what are going to be the answers, but I'm going to define a little bit what could be some of the questions. I want to do this in 3 parts. I have 40 minutes, so I will talk a little bit about the concept. What does democracy mean when we talk about it as a matter of union law? And I think it's important for everybody who is maybe just a public lawyer here, or maybe an international lawyer or a national constitutional lawyer. What you know about democracy in that context is not necessarily at all what union law democracy mean, because democracy, as it is mentioned in the treaty, should also mean something EU law specific. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This should not come as any surprise, but it will come as a surprise for people who work on democracy for all of their lives, but have never really realized that the way that EU now is acting directly conditions, circumscribes, prescribes some of the stuff that you can even do at the national level. I'm going to talk about that in a bit. Then I'm going to come down to a conclusion that, in fact, there's not one thing that the EU talks about when it mentions democracy, but at least 3. I'm going to distinguish 3 dimensions. I'm going to talk about each of these dimensions a little bit, and then at the end, also to facilitate the great discussions that we have today, I'm going to throw up a couple of questions that I think could be relevant based on this very initial analysis. So I'm going to show you a lot of slides. The purpose is definitely not that by PowerPoint. What I'm just going to show you mainly is screenshots of legislation and primary legislation, just to make you aware of the fact in how many different ways democracy is mentioned directly or indirectly in EU treaties or EU secondary law. And I should also have started with saying that it's great to see so many of the friends also online. So hopefully you will also be able to contribute to the discussion later on. I'm sure that this will be facilitated by the chair, if that's possible. So here we go. What are we talking about as a concept of EU law? As I already said, it's clearly a central and increasingly important notion. You know, if you've all seen Defend Democracy package, European Democracy Shield, this morning in Political Playbook, I even gave some comments on what European Democracy Shield should focus on. But the bottom line is that it is, since it's mentioned in the treaty, it's a concept of union law. So it has a union law specific meaning, and to that in that regard, it's actually surprisingly underexplored topic, even if it's so central. It's one of the foundations, but it seems to we have to sort of see what this pillar actually means. So far, we have really only focused most of our attentions on rule of law, also some on fundamental rights. But there's also all sorts of other topics in Article 2, which I'll show in a moment, that are surprisingly underexplored. And given some recent case law of the Court of Justice, it's very likely that each of these themes will very soon have to be clarified more. So this is just to stress democracy as a concept. It's mentioned directly or indirectly in various treaty articles in the Charter and secondary legislation. I'm going to show you a lot of examples of that. And my research question really is, you know, if we compare all of that, if we put all of that, if we try to make sense of the spaghetti ball that I'm going to show you later, do we actually have a concept of union law democracy that has a specific and precisely defined meaning, or is all that we're seeing in EU law a form of inference, implication, or circumscription of what democracy should be? A bit like Farid Zakaria once said, that we have a donut definition, so all sides, no center. So we're only describing what is in the circle, but we know that what we're really after is in the center. So we're interested in the core of the donut. So that's the open question I want to throw up, and I'm now going to show you a little bit where we can find what democracy means in union law. Well, first of all, of course, it's mentioned in the preamble of the Treaty on the European Union. And you see there that we are all desiring to enhance further the democratic functioning of the institutions. So this is a concern with the democracy at the EU level. And there's also a mention of democracy in the preamble of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, where it's mentioned as a principle of democracy and rule of law are mentioned there. But of course, the central treaty article is Article 2, which mentions democracy alongside a number of other values. And here, of course, we then come to the lawyerly question. It should also mean something in and of itself that is not covered by, for example, fundamental rights. Fundamental rights have the right to vote, freedom of expression, all sorts of things that are directly related to the quality of democracy. But what does democracy mean on its own? I think that's something that we need to think about. Are there also other values here that somehow have to do with some union law specific understanding of democracy? For example, recently, if you read the case law of the Court of Justice, all of a sudden a lot of importance is given to solidarity, including in terms of redistribution of resources, or making sure that there's something specific in terms of the justification of why the European Union is doing what it is doing. For example, redistributing money from the rich to the poor areas, which is seen as an expression of solidarity. I'll show an example later on about some of the ways that democracy is conceptualized as a union law matter. That may also have strongly to do not only with democracy, but also with solidarity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this as well later on. Article 10 is extremely interesting for various reasons. First of all, at the union level, we should be concerned with that the democracy that we're trying to achieve here is representative. So what does that mean? Has not yet been clarified. At the union level, there's direct representation in the European Parliament. But interestingly, in the second paragraph of Article 10, there's very interesting wording that there's also another vector of democratic accountability, which is that those member states or those heads of state and government that sit in the Council and the European Council have to be democratically accountable at home, both to either their national parliament or to their citizens. So this raises the question, is democratic accountability in this angle the same as representativeness in the first element, or is this just one specific element of representativeness? Why are national parliaments and citizens in this angle mentioned separately? Is there should you have a separate analysis of how democratic accountability works through your national parliament and another analysis of how the democratic accountability works directly versus your citizens? The thing that I want to stress again and again, if you're not in EU law normally, these are questions now of EU law because we're interpreted European Union law here. So it may well be that the way that you answer this question in, I currently work in Germany. The German Bundesverfassungsgericht probably has all sorts of ideas about that. These will be largely irrelevant to answering this question because it's a question that needs to be answered as a matter of EU law. The third and the fourth paragraph here are again specifically concerned with the EU level. So there's something to the democratic life of the Union, and political parties have a specific function in EU level democracy. Here I'm going to talk a little bit later on a regulation that I was myself involved in negotiating when I was still in Brussels. On basically party funding, which has an element of also something specific for EU law, sort of militancy at the EU level. Are the discussions that you may be used to for a national level democratic militancy, are they the same at the EU level? That's another question that we need to discover. But apart from Article 10, there's also, of course, Article 11, the favorite article of my great friend Alberto Alemanno about public participation, which is really about public participation and basically the democratic life of at the EU level itself. So it lays down various different elements in that angle as well. So you already noticed that I'm distinguishing different dimensions. I'm going to go down that direction a little bit. So where else in the treaty can we find wording on democracy, common foreign and security policy? The European Union is supposed to consolidate and support democracy. Support sounds pretty much like an active verb. So do we have a situation here that externally the European Union is supposed to support, to do something different than it is doing internally? I think that is something that this wording raises, but it's interesting that this active verb is used in this regard. And then we have democracy in the way that we are all EU citizens here. As EU citizens, if I live in Germany as a Dutch person, I should be able to vote in the municipal elections. I should be able to vote for the European Parliament elections. That's a right that is a right to me as a stemming from EU law, but it's very much interfering in how you either organize your local election, your municipal election, or how you organize the European Parliament elections. And one of the things that you learn very quickly when you work in the Council of Ministers negotiating is that, in fact, no such thing as European Parliament elections exist. It's basically 27 parallel national elections that all happen to end up in the same European Parliament, but it's a national election that is held under very different national conditions in 27 different member states. So is this something, and that's another overall question that I want to throw up, is this something that we should take as a given and sell as something that is something specific as union law democracy? Or is union law democracy and Article 2 actually a vector through which we can actually start criticizing some of these some of these practices, or test the legality, the full legality of these things? That's another legal question I think that we will discuss later. Going on, a question that you have never really considered before, and frankly I didn't before I just went through the treaties. Where is democracy mentioned? In the solidarity clause, it says that one of the reasons for the EU to trigger this solidarity mechanism, which is basically a way to help each other in case of a disaster. One of the purposes is that for that is to protect the democratic institutions. But what are democratic institutions in this sense? Are we only talking about parliaments, or is it democratic? Imagine that the court system is attacked in Germany. Could Germany then rely on this clause saying that this is a democratic institutions? What about NGOs? A large-scale attack on NGOs is that a democratic institution in this sense? It's a legal question, and not only a theoretical issue. And I think that we need to think about what is meant in that regard. And also, you know, in our day and age, one of the great things about no longer being civil service, you can speak more freely. Can this also be misused by autocrats, by populists, saying that something that is a democratic institution for us is maybe not a democratic institution for a reasonable interpretation of liberal democracy? This is also something that you will need to think about. So this is just my very brief tour d'horizon. There's of course many other, mainly indirect ways that democracy is used. What I want to just boil it down to is that I think. This is one last example that I forgot to mention. So in Protocol 29 of the Treaty on Fundamental, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, it says that there's a concern with how member states deal with public broadcasting, and that somehow interferes with a national level democratic system. So EU law somehow regulates how you what you can do at the national level with your democracy. So this is also laid down. This is a totally different angle again. So where I was going is this: I think that there's at least 3 ways or 3 dimensions that union law democracy is actually mentioned in the treaties in itself at first view. First of all, it lays down union law, direct and indirect requirements for EU level democracy, what we're doing at the union level, the way that European Parliament functions, how EU citizens can interact with the union level. There's direct or indirect requirements for member state level democracy. For example, you cannot run a municipal election at the moment in a way that would exclude or somehow discriminate citizens from other EU member states. So that has a direct implication on how you run that kind of national elections. And I think that the one that I'm most fascinated about, and I'm still unclear whether this is actually a separate dimension, I'd be interested in feedback on that, or whether this is simply an implication perhaps of the second, is that EU law also sometimes says something about the interplay between the EU and the member state level in the way that it organizes democracy. So for example, Article 10, paragraph 2, second sentence of the Treaty on the European Union, the treaty says that the way that EU level democracy functions, namely who sits in the chair of the Council or the European Council, is premised on democratic accountability at home. So there's an interplay between these two elements, and I think that this is somehow a different dimension. So I'm now going to go a little bit deeper on each of these dimensions, and then I'll go to the discussion. So I'm going to say a couple of things that you perhaps have never thought about because you, like me, never really paid any attention to what is meant when you mention democracy as a matter of union law. So dimension 1, EU level union law democracy, the general, some general elements and some elements about militancy. So we're all used to a system where the European Parliament dramatically overrepresents small countries and dramatically underrepresents large countries. So is that what is meant by representative democracy in Article 10, paragraph 1 of the Treaty on the European Union, that representativeness is somehow that dramatic overrepresentation of small countries and dramatic underrepresentations in the European Parliament is somehow what makes EU level democracy specific, and therefore we should understand this as somehow inherent in the union law concept of democracy when it comes to this level. Because of course this is very far away from the normal one person, one vote kind of premise that you would have. You will need about 10 times more votes to be elected in the European Parliament when you're living in Germany than when you're living in Luxembourg. This is the implication that is now at the EU level. So I just wanted to throw up the question: if we look at this through the lens of democracy, is democracy a platform to criticize this, or is this actually a reflection of what makes union law democracy special? And of course, we have the same in qualified majority voting. There's also a dramatic overrepresentation of smaller member states, and therefore the citizens of that smaller member state, and a dramatic underrepresentation of the bigger states. Of course, and the interesting thing is that this is actually justified for its democratic legitimacy. Some of the wording in this declaration attached to this specific article mentions that we're doing this, we're changing the QMV system because of democracy. We're increasing democratic legitimacy because of this. It's not entirely clear because we made the very bad system a little bit better and therefore we're stepping closer to the one person, one vote kind of logic here, or whether this wording is supposed to be read as saying, well, it was already a great thing that we are dramatically over-representing small states and dramatically underrepresenting bigger states. I mean, I think that that is an interpretational question. I'm just throwing up question, right? That's the purpose of this talk. EU level democracy is also about the detailed arrangements for electing candidates for European Parliament. There's very old legislation from 1993 in this regard. It says, for example, that you need to make it possible for me as a Dutch to vote for the European Parliament elections in Germany, or make it possible for me as a Dutch to stand for a European Parliament election on one of the seats in Germany. So I could be elected on one of the seats for the quotum of Germany. But the European Electoral Act, which I spent way too much time on when I was in Brussels, it's a very specific animal as a matter of EU law, because at the moment it's still sort of a parallel treaty standing in parallel to other treaties. It's unique because the European Parliament has the right to initiative there, so that says something about the specificity perhaps of this topic for European democracy. The Council decides by unanimity and then it has to be ratified. But the interesting thing, if you really look at European Parliament elections, how they're run in 27 parallel ways. We are voting on different days. We use different ballots. There's different voting registration deadlines. It may be much harder for me to run as a Dutch person for European Parliament elections in Germany than in the Netherlands or in Malta. So in fact, we're looking here at. So my question is really: is this something that we should justify because it happens to be union law democracy, or is this somehow a botched compromise between supranationalism and intergovernmentalism that we're actually trying to get rid of, and we can use democracy to make this more reasonable? So that's, I think, the kind of questions that you throw up when you are talking about union law democracy in the EU level. There's a couple of elements here too that are very specific. A lot of discussions are always about militant democracy at a national level, but we have also done EU level militant democracy without ever calling it militancy, which is fascinating. That's one of the reasons why I left civil service, because I wondered, for example, when I had helped negotiate this regulation, whether I had done more harm than good. Because this regulation, 1141/2014, is about party financing of European political parties. And it's basically a system of EU-level militancy in the following way, because the way that as a European political party at the moment, you can get funding, you first need to register. And as a federation of national political parties, you can register if you have members in at least a quarter of all the member states. And you have to have a minimum number of members of European Parliament. And then you can apply when you say that you will do a sort of a pledge of allegiance to EU values, including, of course, democracy. And this is basically at the moment a system of self-certification. I'll show you in a second that it initially, when this was introduced, it prevented a lot of the more really radical anti-EU parties to register at all. So in that sense, it had an effect which was totally unintended. But since this has never really been taken seriously, you now have the patriots, basically the family where all the friends of Europe, Orban, Le Pen, etc., are now united. They are now on record of having a sort of a pledge of allegiance. Yes, we will uphold EU values. But there's also a values compliance mechanism here, which is that either the Commission or a group of citizens can ask for verification whether a European political party in its program and actions, and of course then the issue specifically actions, is violating this oath of allegiance. And that's why I'm calling this a ridiculously complicated mechanism. It's an independent authority that runs that negotiation or that investigation, and in running that investigation, it has to ask to yet another independent body to ask for advice, which is the Committee of Independent Eminent Persons. Now, of course, you're all dying to know, does this exist and who is in it? I can say yes, it does exist, and these are the people that are in it. This has never been activated, and I think that it's still relevant to mention this because apparently it's seen as a necessity to still keep it populated, so that the very fact that this exists already has some sort of signaling function in and of itself. But as I said, this has not at all prevented the even radical anti-EU parties to simply go on record and having a letter that says that the Patriots, this is the predecessor of the Patriots. Basically, the Patriots took the legal form of a predecessor. They did not have to automatically register for themselves, but they took the certification of their predecessor. And there's basically a letter that this party says we are respecting all the basic values, including democracy. Militancy is also, so recently the Commission has actually said we need to actually strengthen this this system, which of course goes on some theory of why it's important to defend democracy at the EU level. So one of the things that the Commission has proposed, and this proposal is currently deadlocked, is that it's not possible for a member of European Parliament to be a member of two different European political parties at the same time, which sometimes still happened, particularly in the extreme right-wing party wing of the European Parliament. But what is more interesting is that the Commission also proposes that normally in the current system of values compliance, the only thing that you're looking at is the actions of a political party as a whole. So you look at it as a sort of a container. You don't, and there have to be political parties from at least 7 to 8 different member states. So each of these perfectly mainstream parties until recently had 1 or 2 autocratic apples, bad apples, but they could not really be confronted in their own rights. You could only just confront the whole political party. And the European Commission has proposed to change that and say that also the actions of one of the component members of a European political party can be triggering this values verification, which brings me back to my previous dimensions. So here you can see a screenshot of what the European Commission is proposing here. It says the actions of European political parties or foundations and their respective members in the Union. So it is also the national political parties. So this then raises the question: is the EU law also directly intervening here in national level democratic politics? What is the kind of action here that could trigger this new wording to be activated? Could it be that Orban is simply continuing to dismantle the rule of law system only at home, or is the only thing that would trigger this is some European implication of that? I think that's a legal question that would be triggered by this as well. Last element of the militancy is a lot of people may not be aware of this, but there has been a very long negotiation about changing the European Electoral Act. And one of the things that is now being proposed at the initial proposal by the German government is to also have an electoral threshold for the European Parliament elections. I happen to know very well the wording of Article 3, Paragraph 2, where it has specifically mentioned that this will only apply to some member states that have 35 or more seats in European Parliament. If you look at how many seats the Dutch have in European Parliament, and you realize that we were a little bit below that, you now realize why this wording of 35 was put in there, because it was completely unacceptable for the Netherlands to have an electoral threshold. So we now have different member states that for some EU member states there will be a threshold, namely only when they're big, and for some, like my own, there will not be a threshold in the way that this is worded, because it was controversial in the Netherlands and it's a unanimity file. So here again, you ask yourself, is this something that is justified as a specific expression of EU level, of union level democracy at the EU level? Or should democracy actually be used to say you can only have a threshold in the same way for all member states? You cannot just pick and choose in that regard. So this is EU level. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more briefly about the other two dimensions, so we have some time also for the discussion. There's also member state level union law democracy. And I'm going to give you some examples of that policy as well as secondary law in that regard. And the interesting thing is, and I think that's going to be a theme as well, to some extent it's interesting that the EU legislator has been much more active in regulating member state level democracy than it has been active in reforming EU level democracy, which is contra-intuitive to say the least. So what is the kind of angles that the EU, the Commission, as well as the legislator has been working to regulate member state level democracy from a union law perspective? For example, in the European Democracy Action Plan, which led to some legislation, which I'm going to talk about. The wording is interesting because these are just some screenshots that the European Democracy Action Plan seeks to strengthen the reserves of EU democracies. So clearly we're talking about the member state democracies. We're not talking also about the union level democracy. You can infer that from the wording, although, and that's in the yellow, you see that to make sure that we strengthen national level democracies, we need action both from member states and the EU level. So it is fine for the EU to act. It's more controversial for the EU to actually regulate its own level. And this is done by promoting free and fair elections and strong democratic participation. This is done through some reforms on the way that you can vote for municipal elections or participate in municipal elections or European Parliament elections. Support free and independent media. The European Media Freedom Act, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, had very strong wording on democracy, as well as countering disinformation, which we'll also have some examples for. So to start with the first municipal elections, it's clear that if you look at the statistics, and you see this in all the reports that the Commission writes about this, that there's many fewer people who vote in municipal elections who are from other EU member states than from the member state itself, which is surprising because there's about 25 million mobile EU citizens, and these mobile citizens are typically quite, and they're often, economically and entrepreneurial or politically active. So there's a real gap there, and that's why the Commission portrays this as a problem and has proposed, for example, to a typical European solution. Of course, every member state now has to set up a new unit to make mobile citizens aware of their right to vote as well as to stand for elections. So this is in the pipeline. Also, recently there was a Court of Justice case law here, which was against infringement that the Commission brought against Poland and the Czech Republic, which was about that it should also be possible for mobile citizens to actually become a member of a political party, because you cannot really effectively use your your passive right to vote if you're a member of a political party. So this is, again, very far-reaching interference in your national level democracy. It's basically, it goes really to the core of your sovereignty, you would say. This is happening. So it's important to realize that union law democracy has very strong interference in the way that you regulate your national level democracy. European Media Freedom Act. There's all sorts of language there that I highlighted here. What I just want to point out here is the wording that's used. So apparently we are only worried about creating better media freedom because this is to build a better state for democracies. Again, plural. So we're clearly concerned with the national democratic level. we're not so much worried about media freedom because that would allow you to engage with the EU level. We're only having EU level activity here to make sure that we are regulating better the national level, which is interesting as a conceptually interesting. So we're having European Union activity to make sure that the way that national level democratic systems function is better, because then you have access to, media freedom is important for free and democratic discourse. Two other examples. One that is very interesting. Maybe you've seen a new legislation on strategic litigation against public participation, which is basically about if you defend democracy and for speaking up, you face a frivolous case simply to silence you. This should be criminalized by member states. So again, it's an interference from the EU at the national level. But it's interesting to see here what is actually being regulated, because we have to talk about this. This is triggered when you're when something concerns a matter of public interest, and the way that the matter of public interest is in itself defined in this piece of legislation is in part it can be defined a matter of public interest is activities aimed at protecting the values enshrined in Article 2, including protection of democratic processes against undue interference. So clearly, we're trying to protect something here from being misused. We're trying to protect a democratic value, a democratic activity, and that democratic activity that EU law requires member states to protect is happening at a national level. So again, it's a union level interference in the way that you run your national elections. And I just found this really interesting. I know from my experience here in Brussels that typically you focus very much on the body of the text, but sometimes political compromises happen in the preambular paragraphs. And there's this really interesting preambular paragraph in the SLAP directive, which says, activities aimed at protecting the values enshrined in Article 2, the principle of non-interference in democratic processes, etc. What is the principle of non-interference in democratic processes? It seems to be some sort of backlash from some people in capitals that were worried that the EU law was actually doing what I've been describing that it is doing, namely regulate a national level democracy. And there was a backlash against this. So, and this is now laid down in the treaty, in the text of the secondary law. But of course, it has now also become a question of interpretation of EU law. What is actually the principle of non-interference in democratic processes? Is this somehow equivalent to the protection of national constitutional traditions? I think that this has again become a question of interpretation. But this doesn't take away at all from my primary point that if we're thinking about democracy as a union law concept, we're having to look at the dimension of how it regulates national level democracy, and this is and there's some resistance against this, and I think that this wording in article in paragraph 27 of the preamble is evidence of how controversial this is sometimes, because evidently some of these files, in my experience, are negotiated by people here in the Perm Rep, who are generalists, but the people who have to give impact are national constitutional law specialists at home. So they deal with elections at home, they deal with constitutional affairs at home, and their gut feeling is stay out of my business. We don't want any sort of EU law in our field, and I think that this is an expression of that. So this is also an interesting element of that. Last dimension, and I'll come to the questions, Madam Chair. There's also union law democracy as an interaction between EU level and member state level democracy. And I think that I'll just give one or two examples. I think that I already mentioned one. Sometimes union law requires a member state to do something at home to make sure that EU level democracy actually happens. You know, Article 2, paragraph 2 of Article 10, which says something about being democratically accountable at home. So you need to do something at home to make sure that you are a legitimate actor in the EU democratic process at the EU level itself. So there's an interplay there. But there's also other examples of that. This is just one example in also the reformed Electoral Act. It says that if you run elections where you use logos, you have to use the specific logos that the European Union describes. So sometimes there's the way that you organize elections, that you organize nationally. If they have a European Union implication, you need to organize them in a way that takes account of this European reality. So that's, I think, an example of that as well. So I think that there's, in this dimension, there's many other examples. I'm not going through all of them, but this brings me back to my discussion, which was, now that we know all of this, how do we then look at the question of whether union law has specific and precisely definable meanings, or does it only have meanings by inference, implication, circumscription, and that needs to be somehow read in their legal and political context? I think that the answer to that question, of course, is a bit of a mixed bag. It depends a little bit on what level you're looking at, the specificity of the legislation that I discussed. Sometimes it's clearly purely circumscription. For example, when it was about the European Media Freedom Act, clearly it's only approached from the angle of that democracy requires free public media, but it doesn't really say anything from the EU level how you then have to organize specific elements of your national democracy, but it's circumscription in that way. Sometimes it's very prescriptive. For example, the way that you organize an election it can be very intrusive in the way that EU level norms work. What I'm most interested in throwing up also to have an interesting discussion later on is just some of the questions that I'm struggling with myself, and I defined three. So I have now introduced this level, these three dimensions, but do these three dimensions actually intuitively make sense? Particularly, is the third one a sort of a freestanding one? And what I'm also interested in is if that distinction works or not. Why would such a distinction then actually matter? Is it, for example, predictable that the Court of Justice is more or less likely to intervene when European Union level democracy is at stake? So the EU level, the democracy coming from union law conception of democracy, or actually the opposite? Is it going to be more enthusiastic about the democracy interfering in democracy at the member state level? If we learn from the rule of law file, I think that Madam Chair will agree with me that it's nicer for the Court of Justice to say what the member states should do than how this should have implications for the EU level itself. Judicial independence looks different at the national level than it may look in the composition of the Court of Justice itself. Is that going to be the same here with the democracy file? I think that's an interesting question to ask. But I think that's one other example of why it can be relevant to ask yourself, do these dimensions actually work? For example, this electoral threshold, right? Imagine that Spain now ratifies this pending treaty change, or this pending change in the Electoral Act, and a group of German and Spanish voters would bring a case against that, to say, well, we are now competing in elections or voting in elections that are under different conditions than in any of the other 25 member states, simply, and this wording is discriminatory. Imagine that you're their lawyer. How would you then argue? What would be your best argument on the first or the second dimension of union law democracy here? I think you would come up with a totally different argument. So that's the reason why I think that this kind of distinction at the theoretical level matters. Second thing that I just going to throw up some questions for discussion, right? And we have two great discussants that may or may not want to engage with this. So the second question is also really general. I have now been trying to understand a meaning of union law democracy from all the secondary law that is there, all the treaty level language that is there on democracy. So should we then sort of cobble together an understanding of union law democracy based on that and take that as a given? Or is Article 2 and the weaponization of Article 2 values, including democracy, actually going to be a platform to criticize all the rest of what is actually laid down in that regard? And one of the examples that I gave is, what if you are the lawyer of German citizens who say, well, it's really unfair. In Malta, it's much easier to be elected in European Parliament elections than here. This is clearly against the whole notion of representative democracy that we're promised in Article 10, paragraph 1. We read your blog post and we see now that Article 2 is being weaponized. Can we not use democracy arguments to say that some of the other wording in the treaty is actually against the very foundations of the European Union itself? I mean, it's not unimaginable you would bring a case like that. So what I think that this throws up the general question: can general democracy considerations be used to criticize the status quo, or should we just take this status quo for granted and theorize from there? It's a completely different approach, but it's an interesting discussion as well. And then the last, which I find the most important, and I'm not sure how I'm doing time, I'll keep it short. How can the application of union law democracy enrich the context of content of democracy generally, or offer extra protections, or teach us something about the complexities or tensions within democracy? I think that one of the very interesting things about what we're seeing is that problems in one state, just like with the rule of law, with democracy, affect other member states. We've seen that in Poland with rule of law, but we can also say that very much about democracy, right? So I think that one of the ways to think about the intrinsic value of having the EU level also protect union law is that it offers an extra level of democratic protection. And I recently wrote a piece on Verfassingsblog, which was criticizing Venice Commission's opinions on how to restore Polish rule of law situation. And I wrote there that one of the crucial limitations for local autocrats is that they can only fully control their local legal context. So one of the things that we could actually all very much benefit from being part of two different political communities, both our national political community and the EU level community. So therefore, in the case of Poland, they were protected as an extra layer also by the EU level. And I think that you can think of the way that union law is now being formulated and conceptualized at the EU level also as a way to formulate an extra level of protection for all of us in democracy. And then the very last point is that I think we should realize that oftentimes, of course, EU law is sort of seen as the domain of a specific kind of hobby people that used to do only market and now do values by the side. I'm saying this very strongly, but sometimes you have the feeling that we're seen like that. We EU lawyers, by, for example, people who have worked for their whole life in ECHR law. I think that you should see EU law now also as a laboratory to really develop and modernize our conception of democracy. To give you just two examples, I think that is very interesting to look at some of the wording in the preamble of the Anti-SLAPP Directive, which is one of the most recent pieces of legislation, where it really conceptualizes at the legislative level some of the most modern threats to our democratic society. The way that autocrats try to silence people who are democratically active. Another example, so SLAPP is one example. Another example is a recent regulation on political advertising, which is also more about the digital threats to democracy, which are formulated. The higher standards are formulated as a matter of European Union law, and therefore perhaps in this case the Council of Europe and that kind of settings, the UN can also learn from the EU rather than just the other way around. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you so much for your patience, and I look forward to the discussion.